The biggest land battle to ever happen in the western United States didn't take place at a famous site like the Alamo or Little Bighorn. It happened right near here at the little remembered Civil War Battle of Valverde Ford. Hey everyone, welcome to Sidetrack Adventures. This is Steve. So after a somewhat dusty drive, we've made it to the ruins of Fort Craig. Fort Craig was a U.S. Army fort from the 1850s to the 1880s, and it's the reason that the largest Civil War battle in the West took place near here. There is a small visitor center here at the Fort Craig Historic Site. They told us we're the first visitors of the day, and only 11 people visited yesterday, so definitely not crowded here. There's a pretty neat model that gives the historical layout of the fort inside there too. I believe this trail is in pretty much the same location as the road that wagons would have used to approach Fort Craig when it was active, with the entrance being next to the stone building up ahead. When the Spanish arrived in the area in the 1500s, both the Piro and Apache Indians lived near here. The Spanish moved most of the Piro, probably against their will, south to El Paso, and that left the Apache pretty much in control of the area. When the United States Army of the West invaded New Mexico in 1846, General Stephen Watts Kearny promised that they would put a stop to Indian raids, leading to a network of forts throughout the new territory. Fort Craig was built here overlooking the Rio Grande in 1854, replacing an earlier fort. Here's a recreation of what the fort's bastions would have looked like. If this was 1860, pretty much the whole outside wall of the fort would look like this. And here's a plaque with a photo from the 1800s, looking at the same position. Heading towards where the entrance would have been, you really get an idea of just how large this place was. By 1861, Fort Craig had become the largest fort in the Southwest, with over 2,000 soldiers here and growing. Also in 1861, the American Civil War started. I had mentioned earlier that the largest land battle ever in the western United States had happened near here. It's kind of amazing to think about the famous battles of the West like the Alamo, the Battle of Lincoln, Little Bighorn. And here, there was a battle that dwarfs those in size and is largely forgotten. In early 1862, a Confederate general named Henry Hopkins Sibley had a grand plan to capture the American West, including California, for the Confederacy. The Confederates had actually captured Mesilla, New Mexico, and Fort Fillmore was abandoned the year before. I'll get back to the Civil War battle in just a moment, but we've just made it to the ruins of the main gate guardhouse. In addition to being the guardhouse, this was also used as the fort's jail. Here's a map of the fort's layout. We are entering at the top where the number 1 is. Here's a picture of the parade field when the fort was active in the 1860s. And here's that same view now. It's amazing to think that this was once home to thousands of soldiers. I imagine seeing a flag high up on this pole would have been a sight to see when this fort was active. Let's head over to the ruins of the commanding officers' quarters and get back to the Civil War. So I was talking about Confederate General Sibley. Well, he moved his brigade of about 2,500 troops up the Rio Grande and eventually came to Fort Craig. At the same time, Colonel R.S. Canby, the Union's military governor of the New Mexico Territory, was well aware of the Confederate movements and moved troops from Santa Fe to reinforce this fort. Here's what's left of the commanding officers' quarters. Just take a look how thick those walls are. This was probably one of the safest places in the fort. It may not look like it, with the walls now just mounds, but the fort was very formidable in its time, and the Confederates knew trying to take the fort directly was a bad idea. It probably looks small in the camera, but that is Mesa del Contadero in the distance. With a direct assault on the fort being out of the question, the advancing Confederate forces moved to the north around the mesa in order to cut off the fort supplies. Canby sent his troops to the north to ensure they wouldn't be cut off, and on February 21st, 1862, the Battle of Valverde Ford began. Nearly 6,000 soldiers fought in the battle. The battle also featured the first and last Lancer charge of the Civil War, when a Confederate Lancer company was ordered to do a charge on what they thought were inexperienced New Mexico volunteers. However, it turns out they were Union soldiers from Colorado, and a Lancer charge versus rifles went about as well as you would think it would, with the Lancers suffering nearly 100% casualties of both men and horses in just a few minutes. At the end of the day, after both sides took heavy casualties, the Union forces retreated to Fort Craig and the Confederates held the battlefield. While the battle was a Confederate victory, it came at a great cost. Union forces had found the Confederate supply wagons and burned them. Their force was greatly weakened, and little more than a month later, after losing the Battle of Glorieta Pass near Santa Fe, the Confederates' attempted conquest of the West was over. This is one of the warehouses. This was actually built to be bomb-proof, which is pretty crazy when you remember the fort was originally built to try and control the Native Americans in the area. The Apaches weren't exactly known for their artillery. Of course, once the Civil War broke out, everything was fortified in case of a Confederate attack, which turned out to be a wise move. You could really see what's left of the walls here. Apparently when the Confederates were approaching, they had wooden poles made to look like cannons to make the fort look even scarier to the Confederates. I imagine this view isn't much different than it would have been in the 1860s. Or the 1560s for that matter. Most of the buildings in the fort were made of wood, so they're long gone, but here and there something pops up, like the rock walls for the corrals here. I love when you have a picture of an area to see what it once looked like, but sometimes you have to just take it on faith that you're looking at the same place. After the Civil War, the fort was used primarily to help control Apache and Navajo raiding. It's worth noting that the African American Buffalo soldiers of the 9th Cavalry, 38th Infantry, and 125th Infantry served here for some years during the Apache Wars. With the Indian Wars coming to an end, in 1885 the fort was abandoned, and in 1894 it was sold to a private party. It was returned to the government in 1981, and Fort Craig is now on the National Register of Historic Places. A few miles down the highway from Fort Craig, on private property, there is a monument to the Confederate dead that was put up in the 1930s, but surprisingly, there isn't much more to commemorate the battle in the area. And that's probably part of the reason why the Battle of Valverde Ford is so little remembered today. Thank you so much for watching the video. Real quick, I want to end today's video a little bit differently. As we were driving out here, we got a phone call that my wife's grandmother had passed away. She loved to travel and was a huge fan of our videos, and so I wanted to dedicate this video to her. We love you, Nana.